what you get is the folks that are rich enough to stay, but also the folks that are too poor to leave, but nothing in between.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern,
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
and today we're going to talk about the exodus of young people from Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Why are they leaving, where they're going, and how worried we should all be.
But before we have that conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
People are moving out of Canada's three biggest metros in record numbers. A decade ago, about 6,000 more people moved out of Metro Vancouver to other parts of Canada than moved in from the rest of the country. And last year, it was over 23,000. 10 years ago, Montreal lost 16,000 people a year domestically, and today it's 30,000. Metro Toronto's numbers are particularly dramatic, going from losing just over 25,000 people a year to over 110,000 people. Mike, do we know anything about who's leaving?
Now, the StatCan data that we have here is somewhat limited, but it does break it down by age and by gender. And disproportionately, it's young people. We do see some, folks, particularly in Toronto, older folks cashing out of their property and moving somewhere else. But it is mostly people between about the ages of 20 and 38, along with kids under the age of 5. And there's some differences in patterns. So for the people who are picking up and changing provinces, right? Let's say they're living in Mississauga and they move to Edmonton. They tend to be younger. They tend to be, that's kind of 22 to 27-year-old range with no kids, right? And they're a little bit more mobile. But you also have the somewhat older cohort, the people in their late 20s, early 30s, often with kids. Those are more what I call the drive until you qualify type folks, where they want to buy a home in Toronto or Mississauga, but they can't afford it, so they drive as far away as they need to go in order to qualify for a mortgage. So those people who are staying in Ontario tend to be a little bit older, but definitely disproportionately folks under the age of 40.
I remember you had this great line about how the most common age for someone to move out of the city is 0. It's like such a weird thing to say, but also like it's mostly people who are moving out when they have a newborn, right?
Well, absolutely. So because you can imagine, it's not tough to imagine the scenario, right? Where you've got a couple and they're living in a tiny studio condo or tiny studio rental somewhere in downtown Toronto, and baby arrives or baby's on the way, and they're like, this just ain't going to work. So again, they hop in the car to find something larger, and we know, they're going to places like Oshawa. They're going to Guelph. They're going to London and Woodstock, and oftentimes they're going to much smaller communities. They're going to places like Tilsonburg or Lucan and so on. So sort of a wide variety of outcomes. So I've got to ask you. You are of that cohort, right? You're under 40. You live in Toronto. You have a young family. Now you decided to stay, but where would have you gone had you made the choice to leave?
Yeah, if I didn't end up getting family help to stay, it would have been probably Guelph. There was a moment there a few years ago where I was looking at Guelph as a potential option. I kind of thought that was a nice place because it seemed like the kind of culture that would be nice. It seems like there's lots of there's the hope of trying to get kind of walkable neighborhoods and some bikeable neighborhoods. I know it's a lot of kind of suburbs around there, suburban lifestyles around there, but it seemed like a nice place and it seemed like there was lots of nature around there. But the key was that I was looking at moving, and so was my sister at the time. And my dad was also, he had been renting for many years. And so he was hoping to buy a place. And so all of us were like, what if we all moved to Guelph together? And it was kind of the place that we all kind of could agree upon. We were looking into it, and then the pandemic happened. And then we were like, let's see what happens. And it didn't end up happening. But we were very seriously considering it. And the other place we were actually looking was Montreal, because Montreal is still like you could have that kind of city life. My husband's from there and has always dreamed of moving back there. But the problem with it is, of course, like, I mean, I don't speak French very well. I speak it okay, but not enough to get by in a career. And so it's like that's very limiting of where you can move. And the pattern of where I was looking to go is to be near family. So my husband still has
Yeah.
some family in Montreal. And so I think the idea was that like we wanted to raise kids near family. Like that was the idea. And I can say that having a kid now, being near family is like such a game changer. Being able to have like a village to help you raise your child is just like it's worth it so much if you can make it happen. I would have had a very hard time moving away from them. And I think that is something that I don't know if a lot of people consider that or that. So I'm sure people consider that when they're moving away, but like that you lose a lot of support when you do that. How about you? Like, did you've moved a few times actually,
Yeah.
right?
I've moved it a few times, yeah, and I think it's important to highlight that sort of cost of moving that you mentioned that those folks who drive until they qualify and move to Woodstock from Toronto, often lose parental help or the help of grandparents
Mhm.
in raising kids. So, in my case, I went to grad school in the United States. I moved to Rochester, New York. Lived there in the late 90s and early 2000s. I decided to move back to Canada after a few years. I can tell you, had I been born 20 years later, I wouldn't have come back. Just full. I love Canada. I've got the maple leaf tattooed on me, but I would, just the cost differential. Like back in 2003, I think it was when I moved back, I could afford to do it, and the cost of living difference between Rochester and southwestern Ontario wasn't that much difference, and incomes were about the same. Nowadays, it costs 2 to 3 times more to buy a home in London than it does in Rochester. In which case, I would have stayed. And I think a lot of young Canadians, unfortunately, may end up making that choice where they go to the United States. To go to college or university, it could be an academic scholarship, a sports scholarship. In the past, they'd come back to Canada. I'm not sure they will now.
I know that that's something that I worry about. Where it's like think about the number of people who will move away, especially to the states, and I think of places like Windsor and Detroit that are so close to each other, and I'm like, well, the cost of living is so much cheaper in the states, even though it's right across there. Um, but you talk about how like the number of people moving out is gone up a lot, but we still have people coming in. Like I know that Toronto, you said, is losing something like over 100,000 people a year, but like it's growing a lot. So what's happening?
Yeah, and that's a really important point to recognize that it's not that Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver are shrinking because they are growing their populations through international migration, particularly in Toronto's case, the international student boom. So now we do see Toronto growing slower than many communities in Ontario. It's one of the reasons why the city is going to lose a member of parliament when they rejig all the boundaries because Toronto is growing slower than Guelph and London and Kitchener and so on. But that's an important point to remember. So we're not suggesting that these cities are shrinking in population, but rather that we have this out migration of young talent from those communities.
Yeah, it's a weird thing because I was thinking about whether it's if you still have it growing. So then, do politicians care at all? Like, I don't know whether they would care about whether families can afford to live in Toronto, or will they just say like, just move? Like, it's not a big deal. And I know that a lot of like my parents, they moved to the suburbs because it was more affordable. But now it's like it's not really much more affordable to move unless you move quite far away. If you try to stay within an hour of your job in Toronto, then it's like pretty much the same cost or more. You just get more space, I guess. Um, do politicians care at all?
I think they do simply because of those frustrations, right? And you're absolutely right that in some sense there really isn't anything all that new to this, right? That 40 years ago you might have had a young couple living in an apartment in downtown Toronto, the city of Toronto as it was back then, who moved out to Etobicoke, which at the time was a different city, or moved out to Scarborough, and it's still a relatively easy commute. 20 or 25 years ago, they might have moved to Mississauga or Brampton, which, it's a tougher commute, but it's still doable, right? That they still stay in the Toronto area. Now, if they're moving to a Woodstock, a Tilsonburg, an Oshawa, Peterborough, that kind of place, they're probably not making that commute every day, and they're certainly not, seeing their parents, and the grandparents aren't seeing the grandkids every day if there's that level of distance. So that's what's really changed here. But I'll throw it back to you. Like, should politicians worry about this? Um, should the city of Toronto, the province, the federal government care if young people are moving out of the city if the city is still growing?
I think it affects who can actually work in the city. That's one part of it where like there's a lot of people who are in the age of having kids that is also an age that like there's a lot of jobs that they fill and in order to have them nearby, like they need to be able to live somewhere nearby. Um I don't know. Like I keep thinking about it and I'm like it doesn't matter if Toronto doesn't have as many families. Like I think people like to know that there's a mix of people. Is it bad for a city to not have them? I don't know because I think that like there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but maybe it's good if in some ways if people in like Peterborough, like if that's a growing city and people are able to build it up in a way that like works for people who want to live around there. But at the same time, it doesn't feel right that families have to move out of the cities, that we just wouldn't have kids around. Like that doesn't sound great to me. I just can't figure out exactly why it feels kind of not great.
Yeah, well, and I think that's where a lot of people land. That they're like, okay, this can't be good, but really can't articulate why or really fully understand why. They're just like, okay, this doesn't sit right to me. I think there's three things that we have to think about. The first you've identified is that this is actually good for a lot of these smaller communities. I suggest anybody who hasn't been to Tilsonburg recently, but has been at some point in their life, go. You will not recognize the place. Increase in the number of young families has really revitalized these communities. Now there are those challenges with growth, but interestingly enough, the province has spent the last 40 years trying to figure out how to keep these small town, these rural schools open. Now these schools have portables, that they're challenged with too much growth. So there are some good things here. I think the concern is for the cities themselves because you no longer have a full age distribution, and you no longer have a full, what I'd say, class distribution. Is that basically what you get is the folks that are rich enough to stay, but also the folks that are too poor to leave, but nothing in between, right? So you get these very polarized communities. And I would point to, the San Francisco Bay Area as sort of a classic example where you have a lot of homelessness, you have a lot of very low income folks, and then a bunch of, rich tech titans, but they can't keep their teachers, their nurses, and doctors. So yeah, I think it's an important thing, right? Because if you don't have a community that has people between the ages of, say, 35 and 45, that's your middle management. That's your nurses. That's your teachers. That's your electricians and so on. So you really can't have a viable community without a viable middle class. If the middle is missing, is just not going to work. And the third one is that I think there are that frustration that people have if they feel like they've been displaced, if they feel like they can't, they've been priced out. It just leads to some really dirty social problems. Worse is when you start hearing this just absolute garbage about replacement theory and stuff like that. It just leads society down some really dark tunnels, which I don't think is helpful. People want to feel like they're in control of their own life, right? They can make decisions for themselves rather than having decisions foisted upon them. So I think it's important that people have the ability to live in Toronto. Doesn't mean everybody will, but just, that it's a choice that they make rather than having it be foisted upon them.
A benefit also is that the choices for the kids to be able to get around. Like you talk about how people want to be able to make their own choices, and I think about that. Like growing up in the suburbs, anytime I wanted to do anything, I'm like, "Mom, can you drive me?" Like, that's basically how I would get around. I use the buses for sure, and I use them, like, I grew up in New York Region Transit, but, like, when it was rush hour, it was every 20 minutes. When it wasn't rush hour, it was every hour. And there's lots of times that, oh my God, back in the day when you couldn't check where the bus was, that they would come early and I'd be waiting an hour and a half trying to get the bus because it's now the next one's late, and it was a whole thing. But it's a really nice thing for kids to be able to actually move on their own. They can go, like, hop on the subway and get places once they're teenagers. It's really a much nicer life in some ways. It's not for everyone, but I think for a lot of kids, they enjoy having that kind of independence once they get to an age where they can exercise it.
Well, absolutely, and oddly enough, I think most of the viewers or listeners kind of know what my childhood or at least teenage experience was with suburbs and things like that, because I grew up down the street from Jason Slaughter of Not Just Bikes. We went to school together from grade 7 to grade 13 back when we had a grade 13. He's had a lot of videos on that, in him talking about his London, Ontario
His
experience
fake
growing up,
London experience.
his fake London experience growing up. That was my fake London experience too, because we were friends. We played road hockey after school like almost every afternoon. So absolutely, and it's one of the things I love about living in the neighborhood that I live in now in Ottawa is, my daughter can on her own, walk to the pharmacy, walk to the grocery store, that kind of thing, which wasn't really an option for me and Not Just Bikes when we were growing up in the West End of fake London. So absolutely, there are advantages to it, and I love that's an option for me at 47 years old, that I can raise a family like that. But 27-year-olds, they can't move into this neighborhood, or they can't move into a neighborhood like that, and I think that's really problematic.
Do you resent that kind of childhood as much as Not Just Spike seems to?
No, no, I don't see him quite. He's a better Gen Xer than I am. He does seem a little bit more embittered by the experience than I was. But the one thing that he talks about, which I think is really interesting, is that it seemed normal to us at the time, that we never questioned it. I could tell you again, he was somebody I saw several times a week for 7 years of my life. We never once had a conversation about walkable neighborhoods or anything like that. So, it's kind of one of those things where, like, if you're a fish, you don't notice the water. But now, having lived in both types of environments, I will take the walkable neighborhood 10 times out of 10.
Thank you so much for watching and listening, and thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
So if you have any burning thoughts about walkable neighborhoods, or also grew up with Not Just Bikes and me, please send us an email at missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.